It was the night before Christmas. Amid the many celebrations last Christmas Eve, in various places by different persons, there was one in New York City not like any other anywhere. A company of men, women, and children went together just after the evening service in their church, and, standing around the tomb of the author of A Visit from St. Nicholas, recited together the words of the poem which we all know so well and love so dearly. Dr. Clement C. Moore, who wrote the poem, never expected that he would be remembered by it. If he expected to be famous at all as a writer, he thought it would be because of the Hebrew dictionary that he wrote. He was born in a house near Chelsea Square, New York City, in 1781, and he lived there all his life. It was a great big house with fireplaces in it, just the house to be living in on Christmas Eve. Dr. Moore had children. He liked writing poetry for them even more than he liked writing a Hebrew dictionary. He wrote a whole book of poems for them. One year he wrote this poem, which we usually call "'Twas the Night Before Christmas," to give to his children for a Christmas present. They read it just after they had hung up their stockings before one of the big fireplaces in their house. Afterward, they learned it, and sometimes recited it, just as other children learn it and recite it now. It was printed in a newspaper, then a magazine printed it, and after a time it was printed in the school readers. Later it was printed by itself, with pictures. Then it was translated into German, French, and many other languages. It was even made into Braille, which is the raised printing that blind children read with their fingers. But never has it been given to us in so attractive a form as in this book. It has happened that almost all the children in the world know this poem. How few of them know any Hebrew! Every Christmas Eve, the young men studying to be ministers at the General Theological Seminary, New York City, put a holly wreath around Dr. Moore's picture, which is on the wall of their dining room. Why? Because he gave the ground on which the General Theological Seminary stands. Because he wrote a Hebrew dictionary. Number. They do it because he was the author of A Visit from St. Nicholas. Most of the children probably know the words of the poem. They are old, but the pictures that Miss Jessie Wilcox Smith has painted for this edition of it are new. All the children, probably, have seen other pictures painted by Miss Smith, showing children at other seasons of the year. How much they will enjoy looking at these pictures, showing children on that night that all children like best, Christmas Eve. It was the night before Christmas, when all through the house not a creature was stirring, not even a mouse. The stockings were hung by the chimney with care, in hopes that St. Nicholas soon would be there. The children were nestled all snug in their beds, while visions of sugar plums danced in their heads, and Mamma, in her kerchief, and I in my cap, had just settled our brains for a long winter's nap, when out on the lawn there arose such a clatter. I sprang from the bed to see what was the matter. Away to the window I flew like a flash, tore open the shutters, and threw up the sash. The moon on the breast of the new-fallen snow gave the luster of midday to objects below, when, what to my wondering eyes should appear but a miniature sleigh, and 8 tiny reindeer, with a little old driver so lively and quick, I knew in a moment it must be St. Nick. More rapid than eagles his coursers they came, and he whistled and shouted and called them by name. Now Dasher, now Dancer, now Prancer and Vixen, on Comet, on Cupid, on Donder and Blitzen, to the top of the porch, to the top of the wall. Now dash away, dash away, dash away all. As dry leaves that before the wild hurricane fly, when they meet with an obstacle, mount to the sky. So up to the housetop the coursers they flew, with the sleigh full of toys, and St. Nicholas too. And then, in a twinkling, I heard on the roof the prancing and pawing of each little hoof. As I drew in my head and was turning around, down the chimney St. Nicholas came with a bound. He was dressed all in fur from his head to his foot, and his clothes were all tarnished with ashes and soot. A bundle of toys he had flung on his back, and he looked like a peddler just opening his pack. His eyes, how they twinkled, his dimples, how merry. His cheeks were like roses, his nose like a cherry. His droll little mouth was drawn up like a bow, and the beard of his chin was as white as the snow. The stump of a pipe he held tight in his teeth, and the smoke it encircled his head like a wreath. He had a broad face and a little round belly that shook when he laughed like a bowlful of jelly. He was chubby and plump, a right jolly old elf, and I laughed when I saw him in spite of myself. A wink of his eye and a twist of his head soon gave me to know I had nothing to dread. He spoke not a word, but went straight to his work, and filled all the stockings, then turned with a jerk, and laying his finger aside of his nose, and giving a nod, up the chimney he rose. He sprang to his sleigh, to his team gave a whistle, and away they all flew like the down of a thistle. But I heard him exclaim, ere he drove out of sight, "Happy Christmas to all, and to all a good night."
The Legend of the Christmas Tree. Most children have seen a Christmas tree, and many know that the pretty and pleasant custom of hanging gifts on its boughs comes from Germany. But perhaps few have heard or read the story that is told to little German children, respecting the origin of this custom. The story is called The Little Stranger, and runs thus. In a small cottage on the borders of a forest lived a poor labourer who gained a scanty living by cutting wood. He had a wife and 2 children who helped him in his work. The boy's name was Valentine, and the girl was called Mary. They were obedient, good children, and a great comfort to their parents. One winter evening, this happy little family were sitting quietly round the hearth, the snow and the wind raging outside while they ate their supper of dry bread, when a gentle tap was heard on the window, and a childish voice cried from without, "Oh, let me in, pray. I am a poor little child, with nothing to eat and no home to go to, and I shall die of cold and hunger unless you let me in." Valentine and Mary jumped up from the table and ran to open the door, saying, "Come in, poor little child. We have not much to give you, but whatever we have, we will share with you." The stranger child came in and warmed his frozen hands and feet at the fire, and the children gave him the best they had to eat, saying, "You must be tired too, poor child. Lie down on our bed. We can sleep on the bench for one night." Then said the little stranger child, "Thank God for all your kindness to me." So they took their little guest into their sleeping room, laid him on the bed, covered him over, and said to each other, "How thankful we ought to be. We have warm rooms and a cozy bed, while this poor child has only heaven for his roof and the cold earth for his sleeping place." When their father and mother went to bed, Mary and Valentine lay quite contentedly on the bench near the fire, saying, before they fell asleep, "The stranger child will be so happy tonight in his warm bed." These kind children had not slept many hours before Mary awoke, and softly whispered to her brother, "Valentine, dear, wake and listen to the sweet music under the window." Then Valentine rubbed his eyes and listened. It was sweet music indeed, and sounded like beautiful voices, singing to the tones of a harp. "O holy child, we greet thee. bringing sweet strains of harp to aid our singing. Thou, holy child, in peace art sleeping, while we our watch without are keeping. Blessed be the house wherein thou liest, happiest on earth, to heaven the highest. The children listened, while a solemn joy filled their hearts. Then they stepped softly to the window to see who might be without. In the east was a streak of rosy dawn, and in its light they saw a group of children standing before the house, clothed in silver garments, holding golden harps in their hands. Amazed at this sight, the children were still gazing out of the window, when a light tap caused them to turn round. There stood the stranger child before them, clad in a golden dress, with a gleaming radiance round his curling hair. "I am the little Christ child," he said, "who wanders through the world, bringing peace and happiness to good children. You took me in and cared for me when you thought me a poor child, and now you shall have my blessing for what you have done." A fir tree grew near the house, and from this he broke a twig, which he planted in the ground, saying, "This twig shall become a tree, and shall bring forth fruit year by year for you." No sooner had he done this than he vanished, and with him the little choir of angels. But the fir branch grew and became a Christmas tree, and on its branches hung golden apples and silver nuts every Christmas tide. Such is the story told to German children concerning their beautiful Christmas trees, though we know that the real little Christ child can never be wandering, cold and homeless again in our world, inasmuch as he is safe in heaven by his Father's side. Yet we may gather from this story the same truth which the Bible plainly tells us, that anyone who helps a Christian child in distress, it will be counted unto him as if he had indeed done it unto Christ himself. "Inasmuch as ye have done it unto the least of these, my brethren, ye have done it unto me." Joe's Search for Santa Claus by Irving Beschella. A story, my child? Well, there's none that I know as good as the story about little Joe. He lived with his mother, just under the eaves of a tenement high, where the telegraph weaves its highway of wire that everywhere goes and makes the night musical when the wind blows. Their home had no father. The two were bereft of all but their appetites. Those never left. Joe's grew with his thought. A day never passed. He spent not in hunger to make the food last. And days, when his mother silently went and stood by the windows, Joe knew what it meant. They'd nothing for supper. The words were so sad that somehow they drowned all the hunger he had. And surely God's miracles never have ceased. Joe's hunger grew less when his sorrows increased. When the coal ran out in winter's worst storm, the fire burnt the harder that kept their hearts warm. Their windows revealed many wonderful sights, long acres of roofing and high-flying kites. At sunset, the great vault of heaven aglow, the lining of gold on the clouds hanging low, the cross on the top of St. Mary's high tower ablaze with the light of that magical hour. And still, as the arrows of light slanted higher, the last thing in sight was the great cross of fire. Each day, as it vanished, the history old of Christ's crucifixion was reverently told. To him the boy learned to confide all his woes, but oftenest prayed for a new suit of clothes, since those that he wore didn't fit him at all. The coat was too large, and the trousers too small, and Joe looked so queer from his head to his feet. It grieved his proud soul to be seen in the street. And sometimes he cherished a secret desire to own a hand sled or to build a bonfire, but reached one conclusion by various routes. He could have better fun with a new pair of boots. He thought how the old pair, when shiny and whole, had squeaked in a way that delighted his soul, and remembrance grew sad as he strutted around and tried hard, but vainly, to waken that sound. The day before Christmas brought trouble for Joe, 1,000 times worse. 'Twas a terrible blow to hear that old Santa Claus, god of his dreams, would not come that year with his fleet-footed teams. He'd seen them. Why, once, of a night's witching hour, he saw them jump over the cross on the tower and scamper away o'er the snow-covered roofs, his heart beating time to the sound of their hoofs. Not coming this year? Santa Claus must be dead, he thought, as with sad tears he crept into bed. And, as he lay thinking, the long strings of wire sang low in the wind like a deep-sounding lyre, and Joe caught the notes of this solemn refrain. He'll not come again? No, he'll not come again. And oh, how the depths of his spirit were stirred by thoughts that were born of the music he heard. How cold were the winds, and they sang in their strife of storms yet to come in the winters of life. They mocked him, but mark how the faith of the child stood firm as a fortress, its hope undefiled. For still the boy thought that, if Santa Claus knew how great were their needs and their comforts, how few, he would come. And at length, when the first rays of light had fathomed the infinite depths of the night and brightened the windows, Joe cautiously crept out of bed, and he dressed while his mother still slept, and down the long stairways on tiptoe he ran. Then out in the snow, with the will of a man, he went, looking hither and thither, because, poor boy, he was trying to find Santa Claus. He hurried along through the snow-burdened street, as if the good angels were guiding his feet, and as the sun rose in the heavens apace, a radiance fell on his uplifted face, that came from the cross gleaming far overhead, a symbol of hope for the living and dead. A moment he looked at the great house of prayer, then slyly peeked in to see what was there, and entering softly, he wandered at will through pathways of velvet, deserted and still, and saw the light grow on a wonderful scene of ivy-twined columns and arches of green, and back of the rail, where the clergyman knelt, he sat on the cushions to see how they felt. How soft was that velvet he stroked with his hand, but when he lay down, oh, the feeling was grand, and while he was musing, the walls seemed to sway, and slowly the windows went moving away. What? Oh, there he comes, with his big pack and all, down the sunbeams that sloped from the high windowed wall, and Joe tried to speak, but could not, if he died, when Santa Claus came and sat down by his side. A tenement boy! He probably swears. Joe trembled and tried hard to think of his prayers. He lifted Joe's eyelids, he patted his brow, and said, "He is not a bad boy, anyhow. But hark, there is music. A deep swelling sound is sweeping on high, as if heavenward bound." And suddenly waking, Joe saw kneeling there the rector, long-robed, who was reading a prayer. "Provide for the fatherless children," said he, "the widowed, the helpless, the bond and the free." The rector stops praying. His face wears a frown. A ragged young gamin is pulling his gown. "I knowed you would come," said the boy, half in fright. "I knowed you would come. I was watching all night. Say, what are you going to give mother and me? Let me see what 'tis, Santa Claus. Please let me see." The rector looked down into Joe's honest face, and a great wave of feeling swept over the place. And tenderly laying his hand on Joe's head, he turned to the people and solemnly said, "We pray that the poor may be sheltered and fed, and we leave it to heaven to furnish the bread. Ye know, while he feedeth the fowls in the air, the children of mankind he leaves to man's care." And kissing Joe's face, the preacher said then, "Of such is the kingdom of heaven." Amen. That day Santa Claus came to many a door he'd forgotten to call at the evening before. Was little Joe lucky? Well, now you are right. And the wires sang merrily all the next night. The Christmas Goblins by Charles Dickens. In an old abbey town, a long, long while ago, there officiated as sexton and gravedigger in the churchyard one Gabriel Grubb. He was an ill-conditioned, cross-grained, surly fellow, who consorted with nobody but himself, and an old wicker bottle, which fitted into his large, deep waistcoat pocket. A little before twilight, one Christmas Eve, Gabriel shouldered his spade, lighted his lantern, and betook himself toward the old churchyard, for he had a grave to finish by next morning, and feeling very low, he thought it might raise his spirits, perhaps, if he went on with his work at once. He strode along until he turned into the dark lane which led to the churchyard, a nice, gloomy, mournful place into which the townspeople did not care to go except in broad daylight. Consequently, he was not a little indignant to hear a young urchin roaring out some jolly song about a Merry Christmas. Gabriel waited until the boy came up, then rapped him over the head with his lantern 5 or 6 times to teach him to modulate his voice. And as the boy hurried away, with his hand to his head, Gabriel Grubb chuckled to himself and entered the churchyard, locking the gate behind him. He took off his coat, put down his lantern, and getting into an unfinished grave, worked at it for an hour or so, with right good will. But the earth was hardened with the frost, and it was no easy matter to break it up and shovel it out. At any other time, this would have made Gabriel very miserable, but he was so pleased at having stopped the small boy's singing that he took little heed of the scanty progress he had made when he had finished work for the night, and looked down into the grave with grim satisfaction, murmuring as he gathered up his things, "Brave lodgings for one, brave lodgings for one, a few feet of cold earth when life is done. Ho, ho," he laughed, as he set himself down on a flat tombstone, which was a favourite resting place of his, and drew forth his wicker bottle. "A coffin at Christmas, a Christmas box. Ho, ho, ho." "Ho, ho, ho," repeated a voice close beside him. "It was the echoes," said he, raising the bottle to his lips again. "It was not," said a deep voice. Gabriel started up and stood rooted to the spot with terror, for his eyes rested on a form that made his blood run cold. Seated on an upright tombstone close to him was a strange, unearthly figure. He was sitting perfectly still, grinning at Gabriel Grubb, with such a grin as only a goblin could call up. "What do you here on Christmas Eve?" said the goblin sternly. "I came to dig a grave, sir," stammered Gabriel. "What man wanders among graves on such a night as this?" cried the goblin. "Gabriel Grubb! Gabriel Grubb!" screamed a wild chorus of voices that seemed to fill the churchyard. "What have you got in that bottle?" said the goblin. "Hollands, sir," replied the sexton, trembling more than ever, for he had bought it of the smugglers, and he thought his questioner might be in the excise department of the goblins. Who drinks Hollands alone, and in a churchyard on such a night as this? "Gabriel Grubb! Gabriel Grubb!" exclaimed the wild voices again. "And who, then, is our lawful prize?" exclaimed the goblin, raising his voice. The invisible chorus replied, "Gabriel Grubb! Gabriel Grubb!" "Well, Gabriel, what do you say to this?" said the goblin, as he grinned a broader grin than before. The sexton gasped for breath. "What do you think of this, Gabriel?" It's very curious, sir. Very curious, sir, and very pretty," replied the sexton, half dead with fright. "But I think I'll go back and finish my work, sir, if you please." "Work?" said the goblin. "What work?" "The grave, sir." "Oh, the grave, eh? Who makes graves at a time when other men are merry, and takes a pleasure in it. Again the voices replied, "Gabriel Grubb, Gabriel Grubb." "I'm afraid my friends want you, Gabriel," said the goblin. "Under favour, sir," replied the horror-stricken sexton. "I don't think they can. They don't know me, sir. I don't think the gentlemen have ever seen me." "Oh, yes, they have. We know the man who struck the boy in the envious malice of his heart, because the boy could be merry, and he could not." Here the goblin gave a loud, shrill laugh, which the echoes returned 20-fold. I am afraid I must leave you, sir," said the sexton, making an effort to move. "Leave us," said the goblin. "Ho, ho, ho!" As the goblin laughed, he suddenly darted toward Gabriel, laid his hand upon his collar, and sank with him through the earth. And when he had had time to fetch his breath, he found himself in what appeared to be a large cavern, surrounded on all sides by goblins, ugly and grim. "And now," said the king of the goblins, seated in the center of the room on an elevated seat, his friend of the churchyard, "show the man of misery and gloom a few of the pictures from our great storehouses." As the goblin said this, a cloud rolled gradually away and disclosed a small and scantily furnished but neat apartment. Little children were gathered round a bright fire, clinging to their mother's gown or gambolling round her chair. A frugal meal was spread upon the table, and an elbow chair was placed near the fire. Soon the father entered, and the children ran to meet him. As he sat down to his meal, the mother sat by his side, and all seemed happiness and comfort. "What do you think of that?" said the goblin. Gabriel murmured something about its being very pretty. "Show him some more," said the goblin. Many a time the cloud went and came, and many a lesson it taught to Gabriel Grubb. He saw that men who worked hard and earned their scanty bread were cheerful and happy, and he came to the conclusion it was a very respectable sort of a world after all. No sooner had he formed it than the cloud closed over the last picture seemed to settle on his senses and lull him to repose. One by one, the goblins faded from his sight, and as the last one disappeared, he sank to sleep. The day had broken when he awoke, and found himself lying on the flat gravestone, with the wicker bottle empty by his side. He got on his feet as well as he could, and brushing the frost off his coat, turned his face toward the town. But he was an altered man. He had learned lessons of gentleness and good nature by his strange adventures in the goblin's cavern.
The Gift of the Magi. $1.87, that was all, and 60 cents of it was in pennies. Pennies saved 1 and 2 at a time by bulldozing the grocer and the vegetable man and the butcher until one's cheeks burned with the silent imputation of parsimony that such close dealing implied. 3 times Della counted it. $1.87. And the next day would be Christmas. There was clearly nothing to do but flop down on the shabby little couch and howl. So Della did it, which instigates the moral reflection that life is made up of sobs, sniffles and smiles, with sniffles predominating. While the mistress of the home is gradually subsiding from the first stage to the second, take a look at the home, a furnished flat at $8 per week. It did not exactly beg a description, but it certainly had that word on the lookout for the mendicancy squad. In the vestibule below was a letterbox into which no letter would go, and an electric button from which no mortal finger could coax a ring. Also appertaining thereunto was a card bearing the name Mr. James Dillingham Young. The Dillingham had been flung to the breeze during a former period of prosperity when its possessor was being paid $30 per week. Now, when the income was shrunk to $20, though, they were thinking seriously of contracting to a modest and unassuming D. But whenever Mr. James Dillingham Young came home and reached his flat above, he was called Jim and greatly hugged by Mrs. James Dillingham Young, already introduced to you as Della, which is all very good. Della finished her cry and attended to her cheeks with the powder rag. She stood by the window and looked out dully at a grey cat walking a grey fence in a grey backyard. Tomorrow would be Christmas Day, and she had only $1.87 with which to buy Jim a present. She had been saving every penny she could for months, with this result. $20 a week doesn't go far. Expenses had been greater than she had calculated. They always are. Only $1.87 to buy a present for Jim. Her Jim. Many a happy hour she had spent planning for something nice for him. Something fine and rare and sterling. Something just a little bit near to being worthy of the honour of being owned by Jim. There was a pier glass between the windows of the room. Perhaps you have seen a pier glass in an $8 flat. A very thin and very agile person may, by observing his reflection in a rapid sequence of longitudinal strips, obtain a fairly accurate conception of his looks. Della, being slender, had mastered the art. Suddenly she whirled from the window and stood before the glass. Her eyes were shining brilliantly, but her face had lost its colour within 20 seconds. Rapidly she pulled down her hair and let it fall to its full length. Now there were two possessions of the James Dillingham Youngs, in which they both took a mighty pride. One was Jim's gold watch that had been his father's and his grandfather's. The other was Della's hair. Had the Queen of Sheba lived in the flat across the airshaft, Della would have let her hair hang out the window someday to dry just to depreciate Her Majesty's jewels and gifts. Had King Solomon been the janitor, with all his treasures piled up in the basement, Jim would have pulled out his watch every time he passed, just to see him pluck at his beard from envy. So now Della's beautiful hair fell about her rippling and shining like a cascade of brown waters. It reached below her knee and made itself almost a garment for her. And then she did it up again nervously and quickly. Once she faltered for a minute and stood still, while a tear or two splashed on the worn red carpet. On went her old brown jacket, on went her old brown hat. With a whirl of skirts, and with the brilliant sparkle still in her eyes, she fluttered out the door and down the stairs to the street. Where she stopped, the sign read, Madame Sofronie, hair goods of all kinds. One flight up, Della ran and collected herself, panting. Madame, large, too white, chilly, hardly looked the Sofronie. Will you buy my hair? Asked Della. I buy hair, said Madame. Take your hat off and let's have a sight at the looks of it. Down rippled the brown cascade. $20, said Madame, lifting the mass with a practised hand. Give it to me quick, said Della. Oh, and the next 2 hours tripped by on rosy wings. Forget the hashed metaphor, she was ransacking the stores for Jim's present. She found it at last. It surely had been made for Jim and no one else. There was no other like it in any of the stores, and she had turned all of them inside out. It was a platinum fob chain, simple and chaste in design, properly proclaiming its value by substance alone and not by meretricious ornamentation, as all good things should do. It was even worthy of the watch. As soon as she saw it, she knew that it must be Jim's. It was like him. Quietness and value. The description applied to both. $21 they took from her for it, and she hurried home with the 87 cents. With that chain on his watch, Jim might be properly anxious about the time in any company. Grand as the watch was, he sometimes looked at it on the sly on account of the old leather strap that he used in place of a chain. When Della reached home, her intoxication gave way a little to prudence and reason. She got out her curling irons and lighted the gas and went to work repairing the ravages made by generosity added to love. Which is always a tremendous task, dear friends, a mammoth task. Within 40 minutes her head was covered with tiny, close-lying curls that made her look wonderfully like a truant schoolboy. She looked at her reflection in the mirror long, carefully and critically. If Jim doesn't kill me, she said to herself, before he takes a second look at me he'll say I look like a Coney Island chorus girl. But what could I do? Oh, what could I do with $1.87? At 7 o'clock the coffee was made and the frying pan was on the back of the stove, hot and ready to cook the chops. Jim was never late. Della doubled the fob chain in her hand and sat on the corner of the table near the door that he always entered. Then she heard his step on the stair away down on the first flight, and she turned white for just a moment. She had a habit of saying a little silent prayer about the simplest everyday things, and now she whispered, Please, God, make him think I'm still pretty. The door opened and Jim stepped in and closed it. He looked thin and very serious. Poor fellow, he was only 22, and to be burdened with a family. He needed a new overcoat and he was without gloves. Jim stopped inside the door, as immovable as a setter at the scent of quail. His eyes were fixed upon Della, and there was an expression in them that she could not read, and it terrified her. It was not anger, nor surprise, nor disapproval, nor horror, nor any of the sentiments that she had been prepared for. He simply stared at her fixedly with that peculiar expression on his face. Della wriggled off the table and went for him. "Jim, darling," she cried, "don't look at me that way. I had my hair cut off and sold because I couldn't have lived through Christmas without giving you a present. It'll grow out again. You won't mind, will you? I just had to do it. My hair grows awfully fast. Say Merry Christmas. Jim, and let's be happy. You don't know what a beautiful, nice gift I've got for you." "You've cut off your hair?" asked Jim laboriously, as if he had not arrived at that patent fact yet, even after the hardest mental labour. "Cut it off and sold it," said Della. "Don't you like me just as well, anyhow? I'm me without my hair, ain't I?" Jim looked about the room curiously. "You say your hair is gone," he said, with an air almost of idiocy. "You needn't look for it," said Della. "It's sold, I tell you. Sold and gone, too. It's Christmas Eve, boy. Be good to me, for it went for you. Maybe the hairs of my head were numbered," she went on with sudden serious sweetness. "But nobody could ever count my love for you. Shall I put the chops on, Jim?" Out of his trance, Jim seemed quickly to wake. He enfolded his Della. For 10 seconds let us regard with discreet scrutiny some inconsequential object in the other direction. $8 a week or $1 million a year. What is the difference? A mathematician or a wit would give you the wrong answer. The Magi brought valuable gifts, but that was not among them. This dark assertion will be illuminated later on. Jim drew a package from his overcoat pocket and threw it upon the table. "Don't make any mistake, Dell," he said, "about me. I don't think there's anything in the way of a haircut or a shave or a shampoo that could make me like my girl any less. But if you'll unwrap that package, you may see why you had me going a while at first." White fingers and nimble tore at the string and paper, and then an ecstatic scream of joy, and then, alas, a quick feminine change to hysterical tears and wails, necessitating the immediate employment of all the comforting powers of the lord of the flat. For there lay the combs, the set of combs side and back that Della had worshipped long in a Broadway window. Beautiful combs, pure tortoiseshell, with jewelled rims, just the shade to wear in the beautiful vanished hair. They were expensive combs, she knew, and her heart had simply craved and yearned over them without the least hope of possession. And now they were hers. But the tresses that should have adorned the coveted adornments were gone. But she hugged them to her bosom, and at length she was able to look up with dim eyes and a smile and say, "My hair grows so fast, Jim." And then Della leapt up like a little singed cat and cried, "Oh, oh." Jim had not yet seen his beautiful present. She held it out to him eagerly upon her open palm. The dull, precious metal seemed to flash with a reflection of her bright and ardent spirit. "Isn't it a dandy, Jim? I hunted all over town to find it. You'll have to look at the time 100 times a day now. Give me your watch. I want to see how it looks on it." Instead of obeying, Jim tumbled down on the couch and put his hands under the back of his head and smiled. "Dell," said he, "let's put our Christmas presents away and keep 'em a while. They're too nice to use just at present. I sold the watch to get the money to buy your combs. And now suppose you put the chops on." The Magi, as you know, were wise men, wonderfully wise men, who brought gifts to the babe in the manger. They invented the art of giving Christmas presents. Being wise, their gifts were no doubt wise ones, possibly bearing the privilege of exchange in case of duplication. And here I have lamely related to you the uneventful chronicle of 2 foolish children in a flat who most unwisely sacrificed for each other the greatest treasures of their house. But in a last word to the wise of these days, let it be said that of all who give gifts, these 2 were the wisest. Of all who give and receive gifts, such as they are wisest. Everywhere they are wisest. They are the Magi.